Lambeth Palace, the official residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. He has just embarked on a tour of 4 African countries, all touched by vicious and bloody conflict. South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda and Burundi. It's part of his mission to visit as many communities in the 80 million strong Anglican Church worldwide. Can he help heal the divisions in these conflict-ridden countries? And what's his answer to critics who say that religion itself is partly to blame for ethnic hatred and killings? Also, the Church is polarised on issues like same-sex marriage and gay priests. Can the Archbishop keep the Church together? Archbishop Justin Welby, welcome to HARDtalk.
Thank you.
You have chosen 4 countries in Africa, either in the midst of conflict or just emerging from it. Difficult. Why?
The Anglican communions in 145 countries. We have 37 archbishops who head what are called provinces across the world, and it's my business to keep in touch with all of them. These are countries, 3 of the countries I know, not the South Sudan, but Burundi, Rwanda and the DRC. And the first duty of an Archbishop of Canterbury is to be alongside the extraordinarily brilliant people who are leading our churches in many of these countries. Daniel Deng, Archbishop Daniel, in the South Sudan, up against it, I want to be with him.
And do you really have a sense that the Church can play an important role in promoting reconciliation in these countries?
I have a much stronger sense than that. I think more than important, the evidence is over the years that the work of the churches, not just the Anglican Communion, but the churches in general, has been crucial in many of these areas in setting up reconciliation processes and leading them. They are a functional organisation across these countries.
But when you make an appeal, as you did just before Christmas with the Vatican, appealing to the warring parties in South Sudan to stop their fighting, one of the things you said was, "We pray that all of you in South Sudan may become instruments of peace." There are many committed Christians in South Sudan. President Salva Kiir himself is a very committed Catholic, goes to church regularly. But you get the sense that you and Pope Francis make that appeal, but really, who is listening? The fighting carried on, many, many more people were killed.
Just because you can't do everything doesn't mean you should do nothing at all. Pressure in conflicts is a cumulative thing, pressure for peace. In the end, it's the warring parties who decide to stop fighting, but external people can't stop the fighting, they can encourage an end to the fighting. The accumulation of pressure from many sources is one of the factors that helps people decide to stop fighting. It's important to talk about it, to appeal for peace. It may not have an instant reaction, but it's another bit of weight.
Do you think the international community should be doing more to stop people going back to fighting in South Sudan now, especially that a ceasefire agreement has been signed, although a lot of people are worried that it may unravel yet because, of course, the rebels haven't given up their arms, for instance?
Well, the ceasefire agreement signed in Addis Ababa, as you always say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The international community must now come in and back, in every way possible, that initial step. It's not a peace agreement, it's a cessation of hostilities, and more or less status quo. I think the international community needs to continue, as the Security Council has done, the increase of the number of UN troops there so that ceasefire can be monitored and observed, and to encourage and put pressure on local parties to live up to what they've signed.
Are you worried about the future for South Sudan, a country that really enjoyed a brilliant birthright when it became independent in July 2011?
My experience in working in countries post-conflict over many years now is that the impact of conflict on a society is devastating, long-lasting and difficult to deal with. Any country like the South Sudan that had been in nearly half a century of conflict is going to have major issues to deal with. Worried? Yes, I think it's always going to be a worry for the next few years. Hopeful also, yes,
10,000 people killed in this conflict in South Sudan, 500,000 displaced. The Foreign Secretary here in Britain, William Hague, says he fully supports the African Union decision to establish a commission of inquiry into alleged crimes committed during the conflict, and he's called on all sides to cooperate with it to ensure that those responsible for abuses are held accountable. Would you want to see those people who perpetrated this violence being held to account, however senior their position is, even if it goes right to the top?
One of the biggest problems in all post-conflict societies is impunity. So the answer to your question is yes, we must make sure there is no impunity, but it must not look like external forces enforcing a certain something on the South Sudan. It needs to be the South Sudanese who deal with issues of impunity with the support and cooperation of the international community.
You're also going to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda and Burundi. I mean, do you really hope to make a difference there?
Well, the main aim of going there is to meet the primates, the heads of the Anglican Church in each of those countries. It's to see them, to talk to them on site in their local area and to listen carefully to what they've got to say.
You won't meet political leaders?
I will meet some political leaders. Inevitably in this job you do meet political leaders.
President Paul Kagame of Rwanda?
I don't know yet, quite possibly.
Would you raise, for instance, with him the recent murder in South Africa of an opposition figure from Rwanda, Patrick Karigai, who was found murdered, and Paul Kagame afterwards said something along these lines of, anyone who betrays our cause or wishes our people ill will fall victim. And the United States said, President Kagame's recent statements about consequences for those who betray Rwanda are of deep concern to us. Would you raise such concerns?
Well, the conversation is going to be confidential, but Archbishops of Canterbury have been meeting heads of government since 597. So we have a long experience of dealing in these situations. Yes, one is always blunt and forthright about it, as my predecessor Rowan Williams was when he met President Mugabe. Extremely blunt. It doesn't mean we don't see people.
You've talked about, in your view, how the church and its leaders can help promote reconciliation in especially countries that are just emerging from conflict. But there's a real body of opinion that says actually faith promotes violence and divisions. What's your answer to that?
I think that's a really good question, and it's a very penetrating and complex question. The best illustration I've heard was from a friend of mine who's a Roman Catholic Archbishop in Nigeria, who said that in many places, particularly in Africa, conflict rests on it's like a pot cooking on three stones. One stone is ethnicity, one stone is economy, in particularly areas where you have very high youth unemployment, and one stone is often religion. Another way that I often use of talking about it is that faith is the easiest hook on which to hang much more complex issues. It's simple, you know, you're of one faith, you're bad, I'm of another, I'm good.
Let me just give you one example. A public intellectual here in the UK, Professor A.C. Grayling,
Indeed.
A philosopher. And it's a slightly long quote, but I'd like to give it to you. I mean, he just said this in May last year, that defenders of religion like to portray faith as a source of peace and fellowship and condemn those who commit atrocities in its name as untrue believers. But the daily news media shows how far this is from being invariably true. In fact, the relentless drip of bad news about religion-prompted violence in the world shows that the more zealous people are in their religious beliefs, the more likely they are to behave in non-rational, antisocial or violent ways. So he clearly says that faith is the problem. It's not just a convenient peg on which to hang your problems.
Well, I don't accept his premise, for starters, because you can, and we can throw examples at each other, but tell Dietrich Bonhoeffer that his faith was a contributor to violence rather than him giving his life for the sake of defeating the Nazi atrocities. Tell that to many, many of the church leaders that I work with today across Africa, some of whom have died in the cause of peace. It's absolute nonsense, that quote, from beginning to end. Of course, faith is misused. Of course, the natural tendency of human beings towards their own advantage means that they will use belief, They may even be committed to a belief that commits them to violence. But to wipe out faith in general in those terms just doesn't make sense.
But how would you describe what's going on in the Middle East now, be it the town of Ma'lula in Syria, which the BBC's Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen visited, and people there quite clearly told him that they were being persecuted because they were Christians. The Copts in Egypt, seeing their churches burnt, some of them have been killed.
Indeed.
If you look at Iraq, where you've actually been, and you know how the Christian minority there is persecuted, it is about faith. How do you explain it?
It's not exclusively about faith. I mean, I've been threatened because of my faith at various points when working in areas like that. But again, even at those times, one was aware that it was not exclusively about faith. It was, people were threatening me because I was from Britain and we had troops in place, because I represented something they disliked. It's partly about faith, it's partly about power, it's partly about land. It's a huge complex of issues.
That's when you were in Nigeria, is it? That's when
well, that was at one point in Nigeria.
You thought you were going to die?
There were a couple of times, yes.
Yes, and in fact the Archbishop of York, Dr. John Sentamu, says every time he goes to Nigeria, my heart is in my mouth.
Oh, did he say
Yes,
that?
he has said that.
I've never heard that.
Yeah, concerned about you. But
It's very kind of him.